All right, I want to thank everyone for coming to today's panel discussion. My name is Raj Slotharam. This is Vijay Rajaram. We're the co-presidents of Rice Microfinance. And Rice Microfinance began a few years ago with kind of a three-faceted mission. So the first goal was to make loans to female entrepreneurs in the developing world. The second goal was to engage the Rice community in discussions about development. And the third thing was to sort of embrace the Houston community in various projects. So to the first goal, we've made over 50 loans to females in the developing world. And Vijay and I are pleased to announce that because of today's event, the Microfinance Society will be making a $100 loan. So regarding the second goal, we participated in the $2 a day challenge. And last year, we held a panel discussion on microfinance, and of course, this year we're expanding that discussion to include development. And regarding the third goal, last year we held a high school case competition, so we brought high school students from the Houston area onto Rice's campus to discuss a global health-related case, and we'll be doing that again next semester. But coming back today to today's event, we've assembled a panel of experts to discuss global development, the challenges, and conduits. But before Vijay introduces the panel, I just want to thank some of the organizations that helped make this event a reality. Right. So first, the Baker Institute for Public Policy for allowing us to hold the event here, the Baker Institute Student Forum, the Rice Economics Department, the Rice Program on Poverty, Justice, and Human Capabilities, the Chow Center, Beyond Traditional Borders, Will Rice College, the Southern China Daily Newspaper. And I want to add a special thanks to Fahad Punjwani. Is Fahad here? He's right here. Fahad co-sponsored the event out of his own pocket. So can we just give Fahad a round of applause? He helped us out. And lastly, I'd like to add a special thanks to Gun, Ben, Andrew, Grace, Sneha, Justin, Jesvin, John, and Amol. They're all RMF members who really worked tirelessly to plan this event. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Vijay to introduce the panelists for today.
Thank you, Raj. So just as Raj was saying, we have a great group of panelists here today. We have Dr. Mahmoud Al-Gamal, the Will Clayton Fellow in International Economics at the Baker Institute and professor in the Department of Economics here at Rice. We have Dr. Mark Epstein, a distinguished research professor of management at Jones Graduate School of Business at Rice. And we have Dr. Alok Bhargava, professor of economics at University of Houston and associate editor of the multidisciplinary journal Economics and Human Biology. We have Dr. Kimberly K. Wong, postdoctoral fellow in the Poverty, Justice, and Human Capabilities program. And of course, Dr. Diane Strassman, director of the program on Poverty, Justice, and Human Capabilities and founding editor of the journal Feminist Economics. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Strassman, who will be moderating today's discussion. Thank you.
Great. Well, if I'm too close or too far, just do this to me. Thank you. Or to any of the co-panelists. Well, welcome. I'm so glad to see so many of you here today, and I especially would like to thank the organizers for putting together this very, what I hope to be a exciting and illuminating panel. In order to keep this more of a discussion type format where we respond to each other, each panelist is going to speak for just 3 minutes about their own research, their interests, and particularly their thoughts and what has brought them to think about development and efforts to improve human well-being around the world. So I think we're going to go in order across the table, starting with Professor Bhargava.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me to this panel. And I'm really an econometrician who's been working in nutrition, health, child development, demography, food policy for the last 20 years or so. And I worked quite extensively with the World Bank, the International Food Policy Research Institute, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and USAID to devise health policies in developing countries. Much of the emphasis has been on nutrition and health, and also on issues of fertility, family planning, and HIV/AIDS in Africa. So I guess I have a fair amount of experience in international health and development, and I will address your questions in due course.
Great. Thank you so much. Professor Agmal?
I thought I'd open with a story that my professor in economic development told me 30 years ago when I was an undergraduate. And it was a true story. I'll tell you the moral of the story later. But the story was this, that a group of American experts came to Egypt, my native country, and found that the farmers had two bulls pulling each plow because the plows were very heavy, made out of steel. And they wanted to introduce a new technology that they thought will increase the yield dramatically by introducing plows that had aluminum and fiberglass. And so each bull can pull one plow and you double productivity. And the problem, of course, is once they spent a lot of money bringing these lighter plows, they discovered that all the bulls were tipping over. So productivity went to zero because the bulls were used to pulling the heavy plow and leaning against one another. The moral of the story is that all development, like all politics, is local. And so I'm involved in a research program now in rural Egypt trying to design models of microfinance that we think will work for the Egyptian rural setting. I don't think that there is one solution that fits everywhere. We need to look at each society and figure out what are the problems for that. Danny Roderick has actually a very nice book called, I don't agree with most of his ideas, but the title is really nice, One Economics, Many Recipes. It's all about incentives, but you have to understand the culture you're working with.
Great. Thank you. Professor Epstein?
I have spent most of my career thinking about how business can contribute more to society, both domestically and internationally. About 8 years ago, I got involved in a lot of work in Africa and since in Asia and Latin America, starting with microfinance. So I've done a lot of research around the area of microfinance and microentrepreneurship, how to make them more effective. I've also done a fair bit of work on global health and education, both primary and secondary education and adult education, heavily around entrepreneurship education, and how we can use business models to improve the social and economic impact on the poor in developing countries. I also teach a class at the Jones School called Commercializing Technology in Developing Countries, where in the middle of the course I take all the students to Africa, and we just got back last week from Rwanda, and really, again, thinking about how one can use commerce to drive increased success.
Great. Thank you. Professor Wang?
So I stumbled upon development because I do research on the global sex industry in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. I'm working on 2 book projects right now. The first is looking at the ways in which the sex industry facilitates the flow of foreign direct investment and overseas remittances in the development of the nation. And the second book project is an edited volume that I'm working on with a co-author, Rosel Preñas from USC, that is commissioned by Open Society and looks at the issue of labor and migration in human trafficking. I stumbled upon development because I have advised various projects in Vietnam related to HIV/AIDS, drug use injection, and people interested in doing research on men who have sex with men. They call it M2M in Vietnam. Last week, the U.S. federal government just announced that they were going to drop $70 million in foreign aid for HIV prevention. And so I've consulted with FHI, which is the Family Health Initiative, and CDC, U.S.-based organizations in Vietnam, as well as other organizations that are engaged in corporate philanthropy to, quote, save women from being trafficked.
Great, thank you. So for the next part of the panel, I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I'm going to give each panelist a chance to respond to each of them, and then we'll have a back and forth and then open our discussion up to the audience. So my first question is, how can aid from abroad be the most effective enhancing the well-being for people in targeted countries. In short, my question is, what efforts, since we all hear of this effort or that effort that one might contribute to. So this question really is about aid from the outside as opposed to efforts that might take place within a country. What brings the most bang for the buck? If we were going to think about, what should be a priority that might potentially be neglected, or obviously there are many things that are worth doing, but what you might see as something that we could focus a little more attention on. So I'll start with Professor Bhargava.
Well, I think, that's a reasonable question, but it requires very much more specific sort of answers. So, for example, if we think of sub-Saharan Africa, at the moment, life expectancy has greatly dropped, and you have a whole, almost a whole society of orphans of AIDS, for example. And the fact is that international agencies like the World Bank, USAID, they tend to treat orphans as if, they were all homogeneous, but in fact, they have very different needs. And so, for example, if you were wanting to focus on Africa, I would say that educating orphans of AIDS is one of the most important aspects, and especially when you look at adolescents, to give them some form of skill training, partly because, there's such an attrition of labor force, skilled labor force. So these are areas where the World Bank should be actually much more active, but they're not. And part of the problem is that many of these people who are evaluating these studies are, sometimes the criteria are a bit obscure at best and actually quite muddled up in their thinking. And so what actually happens is that you start giving higher priorities to other sort of things. So, for example, deworming is important, but, you have an urgent problem of HIV/AIDS, orphans, street children who then become sexually active and go into all kinds of prostitution and so on. Now, of course, if you thought of, countries like India and South Asia, then I think the emphasis there would be on healthcare and family planning programs, especially in backward Indian states where, maybe 85% of women are having their babies, infants, they're delivering their infants at home. So clearly, they're not getting any medical attention. In fact, a small proportion are in rural areas. So, the situation depends on what we are talking about. Of course, if you went to South America, there's been the great nutrition transition there. And in fact, from undernutrition, they've gone to overnutrition in a relatively small time period. So, issues of obesity, for example, are more important, at least for Pan American Health Organization and so on. So I think that aid is, of course, essential, but it has to be targeted and sort of, the research has to guide the practice of providing aid. So I think that's the way you actually maximize returns. So I was just trying to give these three different examples from three continents to make the point that it depends on the circumstances in the developing countries.
Yeah, I agree completely. And Alex stole my thunder because, again, the story is that it really depends. So you have to figure out what is the most pressing need in a particular society. But I think it's sort of a more abstract level. Sometimes the international financial institutions like the World Bank and multinationals, they get caught up in a methodological loop where we don't want to distort incentives because eventually we want people to be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. But in many cases, it's inevitable that you will distort incentives because if anything, at least the institutions themselves and the locals who are helping with disbursement of funds have an industry of aid that is self-sustaining and in some cases quite lucrative for various people. But also it changes the incentive structure of the poor. So I think the most important thing in my own research that I focus on is to make sure that when you're injecting money, you're not changing incentives in a way that will later on make people worse off when the money stops flowing in. And that's very difficult to analyze. But in cases if you're facing famine in Somalia, it's very clear what you need to do, right? Because it's fine if the incentives are changed as long as people are alive. But in many cases, and the countries I work on do not face these extreme poverty problems, but they do have poverty by the definition of living under $2 a day.
And I just want to insert something, which is that since, as you're all thinking about this question, that you two have both spoken about the World Bank and so forth, and there's also a difference between, part of what I had hoped to get at with this question is perhaps the distinction between institutional efforts, also individual philanthropy, and I guess in recognition of the growing rise of, we say, emphasis on microfinance versus when individuals are donating, considering other forms of, of how these organizations do or set their priorities. So just trying to insert like a new wrinkle as for the remaining panelists on this question.
So I agree, I think, with the comments, and I agree with your comment about it being local. I think for me, and I guess, given my orientation and being from a business school, my orientation tends to be much less dependent on the large aid projects from the large institutions and much more about what individuals and smaller organizations can do. And it tends to be much more relying on existing infrastructures and seeing how we can build that, and that's some of the work that I've done on health. And then doing a lot more with training that you mentioned in terms of there's a tremendous need for what we generally, in the area of entrepreneurship training, we need to include entrepreneurship training, business training, and really this skills training, I think, that you referred to, and something that's going to be more permanent and less donor dependent. I think that what we see is a decline and with the financial crisis in some areas of the ability of some countries to continue to develop their foreign aid budgets. And so then the question is, how do you maximize, as you say, Diana, the bang for the buck? And for me, that's really focusing on developing the skills, developing the infrastructure, and trying to think about ways that we can get in, help, and leave. And to me, that what I see, especially in Africa, is I see a tremendous encouragement of developing entrepreneurship training and entrepreneurship and using these existing structures to provide assistance rather than something that's going to have a continuous flow of funds, much more coordinated than it has been in the past.
So I think that one of the things that is crucial actually is that we need more research, and we need to build solutions from the ground up and assess what people need. I think a lot of organizations have this tendency to come in with an idea of what people need before assessing the needs on the ground. And that's particularly salient in Vietnam around issues of human trafficking in particular, where people have this idea that there are women who are victims that need to be saved, and so there are corporations that are engaged in corporate philanthropy to, quote, save these women as a way to hide sort of their the kinds of labor practices that they're engaged in developing countries. Nike is a great example of this, and other corporations. A lot of the corporations that have contacted me as someone who does research in Vietnam have asked me oftentimes how they can help, how they can engage in corporate philanthropy. But a lot of times they will write empty checks if there isn't a PR person that will provide them with the PR to attach their name to these various causes. And so I think that there is a gap between what organizations are doing on the ground, are actively doing on the ground, and what they're telling their donors that they're doing abroad. And so there needs to be more transparency and more research to assess the needs on the ground.
Great, thank you. For the next question, I'm going to start with Professor El-Gamal, and so you're going to be last this time, so I hope that's okay. I'd now like to shift slightly to talk about efforts that might take place within a country to improve human well-being, and ask you about about if you could speak somewhat about the distinction between the value of efforts that come from within a country, and if there are, and what might be the best way if those from other countries would like to support those, how they might best do that so as to avoid, coming in as the savior of a country and more thinking about how to start from supporting what people in a country itself have identified as their own needs. And whether that's a good way to think about it.
Well, I guess the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about aid development, internal or external, is the political economy of the different constituencies within a country. If you have a country with great poverty where the whole country is not that poor, then there are clearly distributional issues, and then you have to figure out, well, how is change going to happen if the people who are already in power are the ones who caused this to exist in the first place? And if you have NGOs or other organizations within the country that are trying to help fix the problems, oftentimes politically it's the kiss of death to have a relationship with an external power that is helping fund them, because it's not seen as really an effort to help the poor. It is seen as an effort to topple the regime that is causing this poverty. And again, the part of the world I'm studying, we see that a lot of what happened in the so-called Arab Spring is exactly that all the efforts to try to help the underclass, to try to correct some of the inequities that are causing poverty, are seen as threats to the regime. And then you get into a catch-22. You either have to work with the corrupt regime in order to fix things on the inside, or you start your NGO and accept funding from outside and get portrayed as a traitor, possibly get thrown in jail, or you just go and become an academic in the US and write papers.
So I guess I think that in part, the question aligns with what Kimberly was saying, that I think we need research in the country. And I think for us to come in and start imposing our view about what should be done, I think never works. I think about the course that I just referred to that I teach in, and we were just in Rwanda. What the students are doing is going in and saying, what is it that we can do? What is it that you need? And in what ways can we help facilitate that? And I think we're always surprised by learning from the people in the local population about what it is that they best need. And I think to the extent that we can do research and to the extent that we can try to respond to their needs, I think we're always better off. And my experience on both the health and education side certainly would validate that. I think on the micro-entrepreneurship side, what we see are a lot of organizations continually, a lot of social enterprises starting up in countries, trying to respond to their needs, both with for-profit and non-profit enterprises. And it's always more successful than trying to impose from outside.
Well, I would agree with what both of these two people have just said. I think one of the things that I found in working in Vietnam in particular, in a country that is still very much operates under a sort of socialist regime, is that a lot of times when NGOs or academics or people want to come in and do research or start organizations or start finding ways to help people in both rural and urban areas, what they come up against are having to deal with tight bureaucracy. And so one of the things that I think is really important is to build relationships with local officials in that, promotes transparency and promotes sort of, government intervention and, making people feel that they can trust banks, that they can trust putting money into banks, that they can trust the government, essentially. And I think that a lot of NGOs come up with this problem where it's exactly what Dr. Mahmoud was saying, where do you sort of go along with the regime? Do you, quote unquote, in Asia in particular, in China and Vietnam and in Cambodia even, do you hand red envelopes and write that out as part of something else as a way to gain access to these sites and engage in a larger effort to help, or do you stick to strict codes of transparency and then have a really hard time getting access and jumping through all of these bureaucratic hoops?
Okay, well, I would present a slightly different take on this issue. If you think of China, for example, and its great development in the last 20 years or so, it was greatly facilitated by very, universal, centralized sort of policies for promoting healthcare and enabling women to deliver children in clinical care and making sure they get educated, and they produced a massive amount of skilled labor, which then was exploited by developed countries to produce goods and services which are in demand here. So I think that agencies and large amounts of funding can actually make a very big difference. So let me just give you an example. A few years ago, they abolished tuition fees in Tanzania, and school enrollment more than doubled. And of course, there isn't enough place to have the regular number of children. When they double, obviously, it was a very difficult situation to cope with. So I think a kind of a direct subsidy to governments to abolish tuition fee, for example, in sub-Saharan African countries can have very major impact. It's true we can do simple, small studies, and we can learn a lot from them and then devise these policies. So I'm not trying to discount the importance of small studies. I can give you another example, which is issues of public health care. So in fact, it's a bit fashionable to say that public health care in countries like India doesn't work and it shouldn't be there, and most people are going to private hospital, private doctors and so on, maybe up to 80%. But the simple fact of the matter is that the quality of public health care is poor, and so unless you actually invest in public health, you cannot, it's only after that people would actually utilize it much more. And in fact, it creates a kind of a competition between public and private providers in developing countries. So, for example, the World Bank has been loaning money to India to beef up its public health. And, there are many economists at the World Bank who are kind of opposed to it. But it's all rather strange because the poorest of the poor are going to go to public health facilities, and if they are not good enough, then they may avoid them. So all I'm trying to say is that, yes, research is very important. We can learn from case studies, but I think for economic development to really take off, we need national policies and massive amount of funding injected into them. So even though China was a poor country, when it invested in healthcare and family planning, of course, they may have overdone it in certain areas, but the fact is that today they are in a position to compete with developed countries, and the same thing applies to Japan 20 years earlier. So I think that national policies are really quite critical, and they're, in some sense, they're missing in sub-Saharan Africa. Despite the AIDS epidemic, there are lots of antiretroviral treatment programs and so on, but there isn't a real kind of a policy in place which says how these funds should be allocated across different things. So, for example, healthcare services, physicians versus nurses, and so on. So I think that's the way to maximize returns, is to formulate good policies and make sure that they will deliver their benefits to a large number of people, rather than this sort of new spirit that we have of running randomized controlled trials about every small thing you can think of, and what are we going to learn and how's that going to help policy formulation. So I think that kind of a gap is what I would emphasize for economic development.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to start with you, Professor Epstein. So my next question is somewhat of a follow-up, which actually follows very well from your last comments, which also there's a parallel in political debates right now in the U.S., which has to do with, if we're trying to bring people up to a higher level of well-being, what should our emphasis be on providing the types of social services and infrastructure, whether it's money spent on healthcare, education, and so forth, public provision, versus which takes government funds, versus efforts to encourage people to improve their lives through entrepreneurship and through kind of individual effort in the system with with less provided by the government. So, let you start.
So I think there's clearly a role for government and there's a role for individual efforts. I think on the education side, I think your story about Tanzania. I've done a lot of work on education for all, which is a global policy trying to push people into primary schools. But I've seen, just as you have, I mean, there's, besides the issue of tuition, education for all, which is trying to get kids into school, it's great, except if they're not building schools. And so in Kenya, I've had numerous reports of instead of 70 children in a class, we now have 110. And we still don't have enough teachers, and so unless you build the infrastructure, this is not going to work. And so some of these large policies don't provide much in the way of benefits, and many of the people that reported to me in Kenya have complained about these policies because they've actually made education worse. I think the same thing is true often in health. On the private side, I think we have though there is some evidence, as you suggest, in terms of India, for example, and others about some of the challenges of private. We have private schools burgeoning in most of these countries, even for the poor. I visited schools in Bangladesh of tuition of $1.50 a month. Private schools. I see a lot of telemedicine and medicine in general in many countries, including India, of $1 a month. So I think that there is significant evidence that that private entrepreneurship can be very helpful. It's not a substitute for strong government policies and government support, but I think both are needed.
I would agree. I think that both are needed. I think that, what's not news to most people here in this room is that 500 of the wealthiest people in the world have more income than 416 million of the poorest in the world. And so I think that there needs to be some kind of progressive tax put into place to redistribute wealth and reduce inequality in the world. But I also think that there is a relationship between research and policy, and that research very much informs policy. So, for example, in Vietnam, a lot of the research, I think when we think about large development in terms of healthcare and in HIV/AIDS prevention, a lot of work that's being done with the $70 million that's just been dropped into the country is around prevention and around, conducting research to figure out what people's sexual behavior practices are, or how they might differ from drug users in Vietnam in preventing HIV/AIDS, the spread of HIV/AIDS in Vietnam, and those kinds of large-scale projects aren't going to happen with sort of small microfinance projects. Not that microfinance isn't important, but that, like what the other people on the panel have already addressed, is that we need both. And I think on a smaller scale, what I've seen with microfinance projects, successfully performing in Vietnam are in sort of rural areas, helping to lift women out of poverty. Although, and several studies show this, and it's similar in Vietnam, a lot of the women are engaged in more consumptive-based practices rather than engaging in actual entrepreneurial activities. And so the reason why research is important is because it allows us to see what people are doing on the ground with the capital flows that are flowing into their hands versus what we think they're doing and what our ideas for development are from the top down.
Well, I don't know if I need to add anything because I think most ground has been covered, except that I just wanted to say that when you have these remote areas in developing countries, the people from the World Bank can go and visit some cities and so on, but even the government is not able to deliver healthcare services and other services. And so I think the role of non-governmental organizations is actually quite important and useful. But it is also true that, there can be some moral hazard issues, especially if you think of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. It's kind of a lucrative thing to set up an NGO and deliver services, and the overheads can be actually quite large. In fact, we did a little study in Ethiopia, Malawi, and Tanzania for the World Bank, which was published in British Medical Journal in 2003. And, we try to show what the overheads were so as to reduce reduce the expenses and try to maximize the number of children you can actually reach through contracting NGOs that actually had lower overheads costs. So I think, it's certainly useful to have NGOs, and even in countries like India, there are many remote areas where even though they're community health centers, they're not staffed, there's no running water, there's no electricity, and in fact, the staff is usually missing. So, it's only the NGOs who would actually deliver services there. So apart from moral hazard issues, some leakages are inevitable, but I think NGOs can be used by governments to deliver services to those who really are in need.
So to pick up on some leakages is unavoidable. I don't think it's leakages sometimes by design. Many of the countries with very poor populations have extractive regimes that live on the rents from various donor agencies, and in many of these countries, the distinction between what is private and what is public is just a matter of whether it's the person in government or his brother-in-law. So I think ultimately it becomes a political problem, whether it's for enabling the private sector to do its part, or for the public sector to do its part, or to build public-private partnership. It all boils down to a political problem. And I think ultimately it's not the training for training for the entrepreneurs is great, but I think what we need in these countries typically is to train the rulers to be smarter thieves. That if the pie, if you invest in your human and your social and your physical capital, there will be more growth. And be like the mafia, just take a fixed percentage and let the pie grow. Then you get richer with it. But they're very short-term oriented, and therefore they don't want to invest in human capital simply because that doesn't produce the same number of dollars that can be transferred into your offshore account as something else.
Where is your brother-in-law, by the way?
Well, I'd like to ask a question about the political context of the human well-being and economic changes in people's economic circumstances, because this has obviously come up, and it comes up not just in the context of the Arab Spring, but also in the U.S. and in countries around the world. And I think you've particularly called attention to the fact that if you have a government in place where there's a lot of inequality, going in there just helping people at a lowest end of the totem pole may not be enough. So what is the there's the dilemma for people within a country, and there's also the issue of this burgeoning interest from people who are in this room today and in the U.S. and in other countries who are pained to see people suffering and would like to think about where they should put their own energies. Should it be in terms of giving to some charitable organization, or should it be in the context of thinking about changing political policies to be more effective or less harmful in creating better environments where the human life can flourish better? So I think I'm starting with you.
Well, I don't think that there's one solution to the problem. I think that for individuals that are interested in these kinds of issues, you just have to find what you're passionate about and go at it. If working for the World Bank or the UN is something that you think is a place where you feel like you can make a difference, then by all means go for that. If working on the ground with an NGO is where you think you can make a difference, those people are doing something important too. One of the NGOs that I have advised in Vietnam is this organization called the Lin Foundation, and what they do is, I think, actually something very interesting. It's an organization that was started by a woman whose husband is a banker, and she was a banker in New York, and they both moved to Vietnam, and she started this organization, and what they do is they link NGOs with each other and create a network among each other. And they also have a network of volunteers who consistently flow in and out, but they go through this one organization, and this NGO trains various workers to work for different NGOs based on their level of expertise, based on what they're committed to, based on what their interests are. And so it's an organization that links different organizations to each other in building a larger community and attacking issues from different fronts.
Well, I don't know if I have that much to add on this issue, but I think especially with the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, there are all sorts of issues of human rights, gender equality, and so on. But the way the situation is playing out, I think that it's very important to replace skilled labor that is dying off early as a result of HIV/AIDS deaths. So I think microfinance and other sort of interventions can make a difference by targeting these groups. So, for example, if you look in Ethiopia, just to get a license to train adolescents into plumbers, electricians, and so on, it costs about $500, and so that's a lot of money for most of these NGOs. So I think that if you want to have some interventions which actually go and, let's say, will get these are small-scale interventions, and they enable maybe 20 people, 20 adolescents to get skill training for a year so that they can work, and you can sort of see that's going to make a big difference to their lives. Again, in terms of, if you think of human rights, it's a bit sort of trendy. So, 20 years ago, UN agencies were very interested in street children, and so wherever there were street children, they set up all these projects. But then, other things came along, and they forgot all about those street children. Now, the problem is that many of those street children are adolescents and HIV positive, and then they organize these gangs and so on. So I think, small-scale interventions can make a very big difference, but they have to be really channeled to some very pressing problems rather than, in some sense, we do want to increase our knowledge base as academics, but in another, I think it's more important that we actually are helping people through our interventions. So I think that's kind of my general complaint against what is happening these days in international development, because any kind of ideas that you have, if you want to implement it, you set up some sort of small randomized control type trial, but is it really useful, is it essential, and what are likely to be the consequences? So I have sort of focused on some of those issues, especially on HIV/AIDS, antiretroviral treatment in sub-Saharan Africa, and how that can actually make people more productive and self-sustaining. So in some sense, what I'm just trying to say is that small-scale studies are very important, but you have to have some perspective. I mean, why are you doing that study, and who's going to benefit at the end of the day? And, are the institutions able to absorb the sort of information that you would actually generate? So these are the sort of things. I think you have the emphasis here, and I think it's in the right place.
So I think I've sort of said my piece about the politics aspect, so I can pass on. But I agree that in terms of where everybody contributes, I agree with Dr. Wang. You do what you're best at, and I agree with Alok about the problem of fads with celebrities championing one thing, and then governments get mobilized, and then the UN agencies get mobilized for that, and then it's next to the next fad. But I'll go back and just reiterate what I said. It's really about the nation state. A lot of the problems we're talking about are problems where the government has a natural monopoly. And trying to substitute for the natural monopoly with an NGO or a fly-by-night philanthropist is not going to solve the problem. The problem is going to be to replace the bad monopoly with a good one. Sometimes the people take matters in their own hands, but oftentimes it takes actually international consensus and spreading the information about the atrocities that are happening. It doesn't have to be actual killing of people. It could be just a gradual attrition of the human capital in your population. It's just as deadly, and we tend to look the other way.
A lot of my work is really thinking about social impact and what is the social impact of various of these projects. And I guess I would like to just echo what Kimberly is saying about following your passion. So I think that's a first step. I think second, I think you mentioned, Mahmoud, about what you're good at. So really, what are your capabilities and how can you contribute? And I guess I want to add third about this issue of social impact. I think we need to think much more carefully about what is the impact of these various activities that we get engaged in. So, I think about some of this work with HIV/AIDS, and I've also followed some work, especially in South Africa, and written a case around one of the large organizations doing HIV/AIDS. And I think about, I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of work in microfinance, and I think microfinance often, it's been pretty widely publicized over the last couple of years about some of the challenges in microfinance. And I think it's partly because we haven't thought through this very rigorously. And what we've done is we've made the assumption that providing access to capital is enough, and just by providing access to capital, we're improving people's lives. And I'm not sure that the evidence supports that. And so then the question is, if you want to have social impact, what else do you need to do to, in addition to providing access to capital, to actually help people make the transition to improving both their social and economic well-being? And so I think it's the passion, I think, is important. I think the capabilities is important. And I guess I would add to that, really thinking more rigorously about where it is that we can have impact.
Great. Thank you. I'd now like to, we'll just see if any of the other panelists want to have any kind of final comments, and then we're going to open up for questions to the panelists. Did any of you feel like there was something you wanted to say that you haven't had a chance?
Let me see, because you brought up microfinance a couple of times, and I guess that was sort of part of our mandate. I mean, my reading of the development economics literature is that actually the value of microfinance is not even the introduction of capital at all. It's the fact that the micro borrowers have to learn to save in order to pay back these loans, and it's the learning to save part that is most important. And some of the work that Banerjee and Duflo have reported on lately is, even if you just educate people that, instead of spending your money on sweet tea, and just save this money, and then by the end of the year you'll have enough to. So I think that the assumption even that the introduction of capital by itself is a good thing may be put in question.
Any other comments before we can?
I think I'll just add a little bit to that. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about with microfinance as I've sort of stumbled on this development stuff is that microfinance nowadays has really transformed. And while I am an advocate of it, I am also very critical of it. And I think it's important to realize that, since big banks have taken it over, like JP Morgan and Citibank and all of these big banks, and that are interested in, being involved in microfinance and providing the assets, the money that goes into it, it looks a lot like the subprime frontier that happened in the U.S., and it's a very lucrative business. In the context of the 2008 global economic crisis, microfinance is something that has been extremely lucrative. And I think that while that, there is a social project behind it, and that certainly there are great things that are coming out of it, it's also important to be critical of it as well.
So just
you can respond.
Just responding very quickly, and I don't want to get into a whole debate over this, but I think as we think about, I'm not sure there's much evidence that would say that getting the large banks involved in this has changed dramatically the impacts that they're having. JP Morgan Chase and Deutsche Bank and Citibank are involved, but they're not involved as direct lenders. They're lending to other institutions. Just like HEVA is not directly making loans, they're providing their loans through other institutions. But I fully support your argument that microfinance is much like subprime, and I have argued this publicly. I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the press about microfinance is similar to the subprime, which is that we're making loans to people that may not be able to repay and may not understand the consequences of their borrowing. And, though, as you suggest, Banerjee and Duflo argue, as does Dean Carlin, about the importance of savings, what we find too often is that what's happening is people are getting second microfinance loans to help them pay back the first rather than savings, and in many cases they're borrowing fourth and fifth loans to pay back the second and third. And so those are significant challenges. I think microfinance can have important contributions to development, but I think it has to be very carefully managed.
Well, this is obviously a huge topic, and I think we could spend a lot more time discussing it right now. I certainly could put in my 2 bits too, but I will resist and instead ask if there are any questions out there, and then we will have a continued back and forth with the audience. So anybody brave enough to go first? Go ahead, in the back.
Well, in terms of international development and just the greater good of humanity, I think that the best thing would be for all of the nations to unite under one global government. This is an idea I've had for a while. But so my question is, what do you all think would be necessary for this change to occur?
Well, actually, that's what Albert Einstein had proposed. But maybe you thought of it a bit later, I guess.
I know that he proposed that, but, so I guess he didn't know that.
When you say Asian, did you mean like?
It's a big continent.
Yeah, it's a.
No,
yeah.
I said every nation.
Oh, nation. Oh, I'm so sorry. I misheard.
I did hear all nations, absolutely.
Oh, you heard it. Oh.
Okay, I heard that you thought all Asians should be one country, so that's. You're in the back row, so now you say all nations is one country. Okay. Who would like to respond to that? Okay.
Well, I guess the obvious counterexample is Europe, right? The European Union was on its way to first introduce a common market, then introduce a common currency, and then eventually to have, hopefully, a common government that will also unify the fiscal policy across the whole region. But of course, you don't want that. Because and I mean, if you go back to the history of the United States, you'll find people who are arguing that federalism is tyranny, right? You don't want one policy fits all, because if you're in a region that currently needs stimulative policy, but the central government thinks inflation is the threat and they want to raise interest rates when you want to lower them, that's very bad. And you think they're helping the New York bankers at the expense of the Illinois farmers or something. So Europe is an experiment that's unfolding before us, saying this is not going to work. And most nations are retrenching and trying to serve their own constituencies so that they can get reelected. How do you get all these people to agree to share their average product or something that's almost socialist? And we know that hasn't worked either. So it sounds good in theory, but in reality, people only care about their own well-being. And that's why people who care about the poor, in the end of the day, end up flying first class to meet in Belgium for 3 days to discuss how to spend $1,000, right?
Great. Thank you. Should we go to another question? Go ahead.
Thank you so much, by the way, for all your comments and insight. I had a question. You mentioned the industry of aid, and and then we were all kind of talking about public sector versus NGO versus government efforts for microfinance and development. Do you think in some cases it sounded like they were competing against each other instead of collaborating? Is that being too cynical, or are there instances where that competition is good? Because it seems like, especially when you were talking about having local problems, like I've seen instances or read about instances where an NGO comes in and gives food at such a low cost that it debilitates the local farmers' ability to create a sustainable economy. So how are all these institutions, they're going to exist, they're not going to stop existing. So how can you put in regulations that will help facilitate their collaboration instead of having them kind of compete to solve the same problem?
I took the last one, so somebody.
So I think this is really tricky. I mean, I think there's lots of examples on both sides of this. On the microfinance, one of the challenges some countries are facing is whether they should put limits on interest rates. I was just looking at a document today from a very good microfinance organization with an average, one of the ones I like, and they have an annual percentage rate of 78.9%, and this is not uncommon. Often they're over 100%. And then you have countries that are trying to impose maximums, but the problem is that once they impose maximums, sometimes they force all the microfinance organizations out, and that doesn't achieve their goal either. And so all I'm saying is I think that each of these things is pretty tricky. You mentioned the competing. One of the things I was just talking about this, we were just in Rwanda. And so Tom's Shoes came in and donated 50,000 pairs of shoes in Rwanda, which sounds like a really wonderful thing to do, except if you're a small shoe manufacturer in Rwanda, and all of a sudden your business is dead. And so I think thinking through these consequences is pretty tough. And so, I mean, I think it's something we ought to be cognizant of, but I don't think I don't have an easy answer.
Did anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. Another question? Go ahead.
This is on the issue of large agencies like the World Bank, UN, United States providing aid to countries. How do the fund providers hold the governments accountable? For example, Professor Gamal, you talked about, government has monopolies, like bad monopolies, doing whatever they want with the money because they can. How are the countries or agencies holding the governments receiving the aid accountable for, all right, we're giving this for education, make sure this goes to education?
Even making sure it goes to education doesn't mean it doesn't go to the crony capitalists, right? You can always satisfy the letter of the law and still distribute the rents the way you wanted to distribute them. And I mean, on some of the infrastructure building projects and so on, there's also the donor agency issue of the corporations that are bidding for these projects themselves getting very cushy deals. So a lot of this multilateral aid is really to help the donor country more than it helps the receiving countries.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's true to some extent, but, what are the alternatives? Of course, you can lean on many of these governments and, make sure that the leakages are minimized. But, it's certainly the case that, one can play a bit holier than thou in this sort of an area. And it's true that even in a country like the US, you have a fair amount of lobbying, let's say, to put it mildly. And, you have 3 lobbyists per congressman, for example. And you might wonder, what are they trying to achieve? And, is this a short-term relationship? Is it a long-term relationship? And I think the sort of flip side is that in developing countries, you've got far too many people trying to, do well for themselves in a short time frame. So that's why the corruption is rather obvious. It may be more subtle in developed countries, for that matter. So I think, the issue really is that you have to have some place. So, for example, in India, we're having all this, anti-corruption drive and so on. But, who's going to enforce it? And all parties are taking donations of all kinds. And so, but, you can't say that the poor in this thing, that because maybe, 30 cents on a dollar are lost due to corruption, leakages, and so on, that you can't go into rural areas. But if you go into rural areas and you beef up the healthcare infrastructure, for example, there's very limited leakage involved there because, it is true that in some cases they may sell drugs which they are supposed to provide free and so on. But, that's a very small amount. And I think one of the problems with economists is that they tend to exaggerate these aspects and lose the overall picture. I mean, what are we all trying to do? I mean, we're trying to improve the lives of these people, and, we should be prepared for some form of... Some people at the World Bank have calculated the aid effectiveness and, what the leakages may be and how does targeting help. Now, part of the problem is that the skilled labor costs in developed countries, as Mahmood sort of acknowledged or hinted, are high. And so, if you set up a panel of specialists, you may spend, $5-10 million to figure out. But I think it still can have a major impact if you can devise schemes which are more direct, which try to take out the middlemen as much as possible. But on the other hand, they address important issues. So I think those are kind of cost effective.
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the constant theme that I'm pulling from a lot of your different presentations is that there's a dire need to make an on-the-ground assessment for local communities to see what the best strategies would be to employ. But one need look no further than the track records of organizations like the World Bank and the IMF over the past 50 years to realize how different idealistic viewpoints can have dire effects on local communities. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is 1991 intervention in Jamaica. The IMF comes in and literally smashes the domestic agricultural economy. So I'm just curious to see what institutional change you would propose that needs to occur in order for these multinational organizations to make more effective on-the-ground assessments for local communities.
Well, I guess you have to distinguish between the fund and the bank. I mean, the International Monetary Fund's mandate has nothing to do with development or poverty alleviation or anything. Its mandate is to maintain the international financial system. And it's only lately that they've discovered that some of the policies that they've imposed on governments might have social consequences that are destabilizing and therefore in the long term might affect exchange rates and the international financial system. But in their mandate, they couldn't really care less. The World Bank, on the other hand, does have the mandate of eradicating poverty and helping with economic development. And you'd be hard-pressed to find these, draconian measures imposed on governments. By the way, first of all, people don't consider the World Bank the bad guys. They bring money. They don't bring conditions, more or less. The IMF are the bad guys who come in the dark suits and tell you what you can spend your money on and how you have to remove the subsidies on bread and so on. So they're very, very different institutions.
Any other responses? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm interested in microfinance and women in particular. How do you see microfinance as being an effective way to empower women, especially in particular cultures or in particular instances? And do you really think that it's a long-term way to help women?
Great question. Who wants to start?
So I think, the evidence about microfinance is mixed, as I've said. One of the most impressive set of research evidence is really around the empowerment of women. And so I think where we are probably most confident about microfinance's positive effects is around women's empowerment. So for a whole host of reasons, we know that by making loans to women, and microfinance is about 90% loans to women globally, we know that the money, the profits that they earn in their businesses goes towards education, housing, and nutrition. And so it's made a big difference to the family and a big difference for the women's lives. I think the evidence on that particular issue is pretty clear. Did I answer all? Or was there another piece of it?
Or could we have another panelist?
No, I don't know if there was another part to the question, but go ahead.
Well, so not to get into a debate with you, given that we're sitting right next to each other, but I agree. No, I think that it's true that there are lots of feminist research that talks about if you provide women with equal economic opportunities, they become much more equal, and in many ways lift them up and alleviate them. And it's true, microfinance has helped a lot of women, but I think from my experiences in Vietnam in particular, it's a very tricky thing too, because most of the women are borrowing for their partners. So just because they have access to the money, and just because we have made it a top-down thing to help women and empower women, it doesn't necessarily mean that the women that are borrowing the money are actually the women who are using the money or engaged in these entrepreneurial practices. The other thing I should say too is that when we think about violence against women, we don't. A lot of people think about if we empower women economically, we can reduce violence against women. But in fact, what happens is it's very slippery and kind of tricky, because when you empower women, you demasculinate men, and so there have been increased instances of domestic violence and abuse that happens particularly in these countries. And so it's a very complicated and tricky thing. That's not to say that microfinance doesn't empower women. It does, but it also brings up all of these other issues.
I agree completely. I mean, so I think in general, I think it has been a strong point around empowerment, but I think there is a lot of evidence around what Kimberly has just described.
I'd like to just insert a comment here, because this is an area where there's been huge amounts of research where by feminist scholars, and in fact there are many different types of microfinance projects, and there's been a growing consensus that the way the specific project itself is structured makes a big difference. That to the extent that shaming is involved as a method of getting people to pay back loans, that is generally seen as perhaps not the kind of most empowering of methods for women. There are some projects that have a much bigger emphasis on really trying to think about what would empower women, and have combined the microfinance efforts with information about family planning, for example, or take explicit efforts to try to shift gender roles so that women are not just simply a conduit for money that go to men. But there's also, and this is somewhat in contrast to this issue of like, what is the effect on domestic violence? Well, if the loan affects women so that they are able to become independent entrepreneurs so that they can live independent lives, they could be protected from domestic violence in a way that wouldn't be possible if they were stuck in a home. On the other hand, there's always the question that comes back is this the best way to get them out of an abusive relationship, or would actually a job be better than expecting a lot of people in very poor countries to try to become entrepreneurs selling things to other people who are themselves extremely impoverished. So there are many different, sometimes people just think of microfinance as it's one thing, but it's very specific in terms of the type of program that's being run, where it's being handled, and many other details. Women's World Banking is quite a sort of categorization of these whole factors that really. So it is somewhat. It's hard to just make a sweeping judgment, I guess, is what I would say. Anyway, I guess I'm the moderator. I'm not really supposed to talk, but I couldn't resist. Anybody else want to add on to that? Okay, more questions. Go ahead.
Yeah. There, a lot of the places where they use microfinance are places of extreme poverty. My question is, shouldn't the microfinance program sometimes come with some sort of aid first or something to create some sort of economic activity? Is it really like the best idea to give debt to people that are already in really like bad economic environments or places where there's just not much economic activity in the first place? Like, is that really the best way to deal with that situation, or?
Or I'm not sure I understand. Are you saying, or it should be in conjunction with aid? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like should there be some aid where you just like give people some sort of financial, like money in a way, or some like do something else besides just giving them like something they're gonna have to pay back and giving them debt when there's already like not much economic activity. So like whatever you're gonna do, it's not like you're gonna have to have a market for it, and there might not be much of a market.
Well, you do the entrepreneurship training, so we can go into the order. I have something to say.
So just very briefly. So, number one, I think that a lot of my work has been around where microfinance ought to be and where it is. And one of the challenges is that microfinance tends to be in the large metropolitan areas, large urban centers. And so you go into Nairobi or you go into Managua, Nicaragua, and you'll see more microfinance organizations. They're all competing with each other, stealing clients, stealing employees, fighting to get more of their business. Whereas if you go 100 miles outside of those towns, it's hard to find any microfinance organizations. The same thing's true with conflict zones. There's almost no microfinance in Sudan. There's almost no microfinancing in the DRC, and where it's really desperately needed. So that's first about where it is. In terms of the idea of microfinance is, and where it started, is really to help the poorest of the poor. And so if you look at who gets microfinance loans, it is typically traders. So they're selling bananas or selling tomatoes or selling, or they're providing a service, seamstress or beautician. As Mahmoud mentioned, for me it's really around providing some livelihood training and providing some entrepreneurship and business skills to go along with it to help them. Now that helps those people, and I think there's some evidence to that. One of the challenges that I might throw to the economists in the group is one of the concerns I have when I've helped this person selling bananas to improve their life and increase their income, which we've done through training, is whether it's really helped economic development, or if all I've done is help that person, banana seller, make more money, and the banana seller down the street is making less money because there's no more economic development in the country, there's no more capital being imported, and there's no more productivity being increased. And so it's a question of whether you're really making a significant difference.
Well, I just want to say that I have been informed that I was misguided as to when this was supposed to end. So I'm impressed with how impatient you all have been, and I apologize if I've been continuing to accept questions, but really I'm going to cut it off at this point, and we can all ask more questions and have continued conversations among the panelists more informally at this point.
Yeah, so please join me in thanking all our panelists and our moderators. And please join us outside for dinner. We have it, so just come outside and take a left. The food is there, so please join us. Thank you.